The whole war council had gone silent around that long table, and then the king went silent too, and I still had not noticed a single one of them was in the room. I was on my knees in the far corner, scrubbing a wine stain that had waited 3 days for anyone to have the time to clean it, humming without thinking. The way I always hum when a task is tedious enough to need company, and I did not understand, when I finally looked up, why 12 of the most powerful lords in the Iron Territories were staring at me in a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. But that is very near the middle of it, and a woman who tells you the middle before she has earned it deserves to be turned off. Let me go back to an ordinary evening and a song I never meant for anyone to hear. I am Thessaly, a maid in the lower household of the Iron Territories, and I have scrubbed floors since I was old enough to hold a brush properly. I have no bloodline worth naming, and no ambitions beyond a clean corner and a fair wage, and I have found, over the years, that the work goes easier with a song under my breath, even when, especially when, no one is listening. I did not learn my songs from any grand teacher. I learnt them the way most common folk learn anything worth keeping, from my grandmother, who learnt them from hers, an unbroken line of ordinary women, humming ordinary comfort into ordinary evenings for longer than anyone could properly trace. There was a war on, that season, a long, grinding border conflict that had cost the Iron Territories 2 years and more good wolves than anyone liked to count aloud, and the great council chamber had become, in those months, less a room for governance and more a room for exhaustion. Lords and generals arguing themselves hoarse over maps and supply lines, while King Bjorn sat at the head of it all looking. Every single time I glimpsed him in passing, like a man who had forgotten what an unbroken night's sleep felt like. I was sent to clean the chamber late one evening, well after the council's usual hour had ended, on the understanding, a wrong understanding, as it turned out, that the room stood empty. I worked my way to the far corner, where an old wine stain had been waiting 3 days for someone with a spare hour, and I fell, without deciding to, into the habit of a lifetime, humming, low and half-conscious. The same old lullaby my grandmother used to hum over her own mending, a simple wordless tune at first. And then, as the tedious stain finally began to lift, a few of the actual words, sung soft and low under my breath the way you sing, when you believe entirely that no one in the world can hear you. I did not know the council had run long that evening. I did not know a dozen exhausted lords still sat around that table in low, tired argument, nor that the king himself remained among them, 3 days into a stretch of sleeplessness that had begun to show plainly on every hard line of his face. I only knew, when I finally paused to wring out my cloth and glanced up out of some idle habit, that the entire room had gone completely, unnaturally silent, and that every single person at that long table was looking at me. If you want to know why an old lullaby stopped a war council cold, and why the king himself went quieter than any of them, then stay with me. Follow this one to the end. I believed, that whole evening, that I had simply embarrassed myself in front of my betters. I would learn, before the year was out, that I had done something else entirely, and that the truth of it had been buried for longer than I had been alive. Forgive me, I said, scrambling up from my knees, my whole face going hot with mortification. I didn't know anyone was still. I'll come back another time. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to disturb the council. Sing it again, the king said. I had never, in my whole life working in that household, heard King Bjorn address a servant directly, let alone with a request that made no sense at all in the middle of a war council. I looked at him, and I understood, from the particular stillness in his face, that something in the room had shifted in a way I did not yet understand, and had certainly never intended. Your Grace, I only hum while I work. It's nothing. I can go and let the council. Sing it again, he said, quieter this time, and there was something raw underneath the command that made every lord at that table go very carefully, still. the way men go still around a king whose exhaustion has finally cracked something open that has been held shut a long while. Please. I did not know how to refuse a king asking please. I sang it, self-conscious and shaking, the same simple lullaby, low in that hushed chamber, and I watched King Bjorn's face do something I had never once seen a powerful man's face do in front of his own assembled lords. It broke, quietly, entirely, the exhaustion and the grief he had clearly been holding at bay, through 3 sleepless days finally overwhelming whatever composure had kept it contained, and he put his face briefly in his own hands, and the whole council watched their king weep at the sound of a scullery maid's song. And no one, not one lord in that entire chamber, dared say a single word about it. Where, he said, when he had gathered himself enough to speak. Did you learn that song? From my grandmother, I said, bewildered and mortified in equal measure. She learned it from hers. It's just an old lullaby, Your Grace. Common folk have sung it for as long as anyone remembers. I didn't think. My mother sang it to me, he said, very quietly, every single night, until the night she died. I have not heard another living soul sing it in 20 years. I did not think anyone outside our own family still knew it. I did not understand, that night, why a queen's private lullaby would be the same simple song my own grandmother had sung over her mending in a scullery kitchen. I would understand it eventually, and the understanding would cost more than either of us expected. The War Council dismissed itself in a stunned, careful silence shortly after, and I was excused with a courtesy I had never once received from that room, and I went back to my narrow servants' quarters that night entirely unable to explain to myself what had just happened. Only that I had accidentally broken something open in a king that an entire war had not managed to touch. He sought me out the following week, in the lower kitchens, with the same careful, faintly bewildered courtesy he had shown that first night, and he asked me, gently, whether I might sing the song again, in private, away from the council's eyes. I did. And he asked, after, about my grandmother and her grandmother before her, and the ordinary unbroken chain of common women who had passed that song down through however many generations, and I watched him listen the way I imagine a man listens when he is trying to solve a puzzle that matters far more than he is willing to say aloud. His wolf came to the kitchens with him, more often than not, and it would settle near me while I worked. Calm in a way I noticed the kitchen staff whispering about. Because a king's wolf, they said, did not ordinarily leave its master's side to lie warm and easy beside a scrubbing maid. I did not understand, in those early weeks, why the king's careful courtesy toward me kept deepening rather than fading the way I expected a strange, sleepless grief to fade once explained. I told myself it was simply gratitude, or curiosity, or the particular fondness a grieving man sometimes attaches to whatever accidentally comforted him in a low moment. I did not let myself imagine it might be anything more, because a scullery maid who imagines herself into a king's private affections is a scullery maid setting herself up for a very particular kind of humiliation, and I had watched it happen to other women in other households, and I had promised myself it would not happen to me. Lord Wistarn found me in the lower corridor around the 4th week, and I understood at once, from the particular careful warmth of his voice, exactly what shape of warning was coming. "You have made quite an impression on the king," he said, examining me with an expression of polite, contained distaste. "It is, in its way, a sweet story, a maid's simple song easing an exhausted man's grief. But I must caution you, out of genuine concern for your own safety as much as the crown's dignity, against reading too much into his continued attention. The king is a grieving man reaching, understandably, for whatever eased his mother's memory. It would be a grave misunderstanding, and a dangerous one, for a common maid to mistake that grief for genuine regard. His voice was warm, careful, and underneath it, plainly cold. The bloodlines of this court exist for a reason, my dear. A king's affections may wander in a low moment, but his crown does not, and cannot, follow. I would hate to see you humiliated, or worse, for believing otherwise. He left me with that, and it did precisely the work he intended, because it named the exact fear I had been carrying and refusing to examine directly. A grieving man's passing comfort. Of course. What else could I possibly be, to a king, but a common song that happened to ease a hard week? I resolved, that night, to stop singing for him entirely, to let the strange accidental closeness of the past month fade back into its proper distance before it could cost either of us anything. I have made resolutions like that before. I did not manage to keep this one any better than I ever managed the others, because Bjorn kept seeking me out regardless, and I found, against every careful resolve, that I did not actually want to be the one who ended it. The truth came out slowly, over the weeks that followed, in a way I did not expect, and could not have engineered if I had tried. It began with a strange, careful silence I noticed whenever any lord of the older generation was asked, in passing court gossip, about the late Queen's girlhood, where her own family had held land, which noble house she had been born into, the ordinary genealogical detail that courtiers usually recite without thinking. No one, I realized slowly, ever actually answered the question. They deflected, or changed the subject, or offered some vague, unspecific praise of her grace and bearing that answered nothing at all. I asked Bjorn directly, one evening in the kitchens, because I have never once in my life been able to leave a strange silence unexamined. No one will tell me where your mother came from, I said. Not her house, not her family, nothing specific at all. I've asked 3 different courtiers now, and gotten 3 different kinds of nothing. Why does an entire court go quiet at the mention of a beloved queen's own girlhood? He was silent for a long time, the fire ticking in the kitchen hearth, and when he answered, his voice had gone rough, in a way I had come to recognize as the sound of a truth he had carried alone for a long while. Because she was not born to any noble house at all, he said. My mother was a common woman, Thessaly, a weaver's daughter, from a village not unlike wherever your own grandmother once lived, who caught my father's eye at a harvest fair long before either of them expected a crown to matter, and who he loved enough to defy every adviser who told him a king could not marry beneath his station. The court could not accept a common queen outright, not then, and so my father did what powerful men have always done with an inconvenient truth. He buried it. He commissioned a false genealogy, quietly, generously paid for the silence of anyone who remembered her true origins, and by the time I was born, the story had hardened into simple fact that no one living dared question. My mother sang me the songs of her own girlhood every night of my life, in private, because they were the one true thing about herself the crown allowed her to keep, and she is 20 years dead, and I am the only person alive who was ever permitted to hear them, until a scullery maid hummed one over a wine stain and cracked open 20 years of grief I did not know I was still carrying. I stood in that kitchen and felt the whole shape of Lord Woyston's warning, a king's affections may wander, but his crown does not follow bloodlines, collapse entirely, because the crown itself, I now understood, had already crossed that very line once before, and simply lied about it for a generation to protect the comfortable myth of noble purity. That was the moment my careful, embarrassed apology, I didn't know anyone could hear me, forgive me, hardened into something entirely different. Then the whole reason no one will speak of her origins, I said slowly, isn't grief. It's fear. Fear that if the truth got out, the whole court's precious bloodline mythology would come apart, because the most beloved queen this territory ever had was born exactly as common as I am. My voice had gone harder than I had ever let it go in that household. I am done apologizing for a song that turns out to be the truest thing in this entire fortress. I learnt it from a common woman, the same as your mother did, and I am not going to shrink myself down to fit a lie the nobility built to protect their own comfortable story. Lord Whiston understood, within weeks, exactly what danger my growing closeness with the king represented to the whole careful architecture he and men like him had spent a generation maintaining, and he moved to end it the only way a cornered clever man ever does. He arranged, quietly, for the truth of the old queen's origins to be threatened with public exposure. Not to reveal it honestly, which would have cost him nothing, but to twist it, through carefully placed rumour, into a scandal implying the current king himself was somehow illegitimate, his whole claim to the throne corrupted by his mother's common blood. A lie built cleverly enough that unravelling it required exposing the true, buried history, which he calculated the king would never risk doing publicly to save a mere scullery maid from disgrace. He believed, I think genuinely, that Bjorn would let the rumour stand, let me be quietly removed from court to smother the whole matter, rather than confirm publicly that his own beloved mother had been common-born. He nearly succeeded, because it was cleverly built, and because the cost of correcting it was in fact exactly as large as he calculated. The rumour broke at a public presentation before the full assembled nobility, a formal gathering meant to honour the war's slowly approaching end, twisted at the last moment into a referendum on the king's own legitimacy, with Lord Whiston positioned at the centre of it, reasonable and grave, calling for a formal inquiry into the crown's bloodline before any further honours could properly be conferred. I was not meant to be part of that gathering at all. I came only because Bjorn had asked me, quietly, the evening before, to attend, and I understood, standing at the edge of that grand hall while Wistarn's careful rumour unfolded in real time before the assembled lords, that he had known this confrontation was coming, and had wanted me there when it did. This inquiry is built on a lie about a lie, I said, before Bjorn could speak, because I have never once in my life been able to watch an unfair thing unfold in silence when I had the power to say something about it. Lord Whiston does not actually believe the king is illegitimate. He is counting on the king staying silent about the true history, rather than confirm, in front of all of you, that the late queen was common-born, because that truth would cost this court its whole comfortable myth of pure bloodlines far more than any invented scandal about legitimacy ever could. The hall went utterly silent, in the particular way a room goes silent when it has just heard the one thing no one was supposed to say aloud. Bjorn rose. He did not look at me with alarm, or panic, or the careful calculation of a man protecting a secret. He looked, instead, like a man finally setting down a weight he had carried alone for 20 years. "She is right," he said, and his voice filled that hall to the rafters. "My mother was born a weaver's daughter in a village most of you have never heard named. My father buried the truth to protect a court too fragile to accept a common queen. And I have carried that silence my whole life, because I believed, as he did, that this territory's stability depended on the lie. I no longer believe that. I believe it depended, instead, on this nobility's comfort, which is not the same thing at all." His eyes found mine. A scullery maid sang me my dead mother's lullaby over a wine stain, and in doing so reminded me that the greatest queen this territory ever had came from exactly the same common stock every lord in this hall has spent a generation pretending does not belong anywhere near this throne. I am done protecting that comfortable lie. Lord Whistarn built his inquiry on the assumption that I would rather see an innocent woman disgraced than admit the truth about my own mother. He was wrong. The hall's certainty turned, all at once, the way weather turns, and Lord Whistarn, exposed as having built his entire scandal on a calculated bet about what the king would rather hide, made one last desperate move. He called for guards to remove me from the hall before I could say anything further, claiming, wildly, that a common maid had no standing to speak at a formal inquiry and represented, by her mere presence, an insult to the assembled nobility. The guards hesitated, and in that hesitation, King Bjorn's wolf, which had been pacing with mounting agitation at the edge of the hall throughout the whole confrontation, finally crossed the full length of that chamber and placed itself squarely between me and the approaching guards. And it did not growl at them. It simply sat, immovable, the way a beast sits when it has decided, on its own authority, that a line has been drawn and will not be crossed. One of Wistan's own hired men, more desperate than careful, shoved past the wolf to reach me directly, and in the scramble that followed, I took a hard, glancing blow across my shoulder, meant to drag me bodily from the hall, enough to split the skin and send me stumbling against the very table where the inquiry's false charges had been laid out. A real, immediate cost, the plain proof, in front of the whole assembled court, of exactly how far Lord Wistan's faction was willing to go to protect a lie. Bjorn reached me before the man could try again, and the strongest wolf alive put himself between me and the whole chamber, blood already showing at my shoulder, and something in him, watched by every lord who mattered in the Iron Territories, finally and entirely broke open. "Enough," he said, and it was the same word. I would realize later that another silenced king had once used to end another lie in another corridor, though I did not yet know that story. Lord Wistan built a scandal to protect a myth this court has clung to for a generation, and when the truth threatened that myth, his own men struck an innocent woman rather than let it be spoken plainly. Strip him of his seat on this council. Exile him from this court, and let it be recorded, from this day, that the crown of the Iron Territories was built, in truth, on the marriage of a king and a weaver's daughter, and that I am prouder of that truth than I have ever been of the lie my father asked me to protect in its place. Lord Wistan was removed from the hall within the hour, stripped of his seat and his standing, and the inquiry that had been meant to end my presence at court instead ended his. I am told he did not accept it gracefully. I did not need to watch it to be satisfied. Bjorn knelt beside me where I sat, my shoulder bleeding, in front of the whole recovering assembly, and took my wound carefully in his hands. "I have carried my mother's secret alone for 20 years, he said, believing it was the price of this crown's stability. You sang a song over a wine stain and reminded me, without meaning to, that the truth was never actually the danger. The lie was, stay, Thessaly, not as a maid I am indulging in a low moment of grief, as the woman who gave me back the courage to stop protecting a myth that was never worth what it cost my own mother's memory. I sat in that hall with a bleeding shoulder and a king on his knees before me, and I did the only thing I have ever known how to do, which is tell the truth. I didn't know anyone was in that room, I said, and the whole recovering hall leaned in to hear the maid answer the king. I certainly didn't know I was about to crack open 20 years of a secret this whole court built its comfort on. I just hummed a song my grandmother taught me, the way I always do when a task needs company. I let him see me smile, though my shoulder ached fiercely. It turns out that was the whole of it. A common woman's song, sung by another common woman, in a hall built by men who spent a generation pretending the two things could never belong to the same throne twice. He kissed me then, gently, mindful of my wound. One breath, no more. A kiss that said a whole sentence and did not need to become a scene. And what broke open in me was not the thing the songs promise. It was recognition, plain and total. The vertigo of being the one voice that had finally let a grieving king set down a secret 2 generations had insisted he carry alone. His wolf pressed against us both, warm and steady. And the hall that had gathered to question a king's legitimacy watched instead the strongest wolf alive claim, at long last, the one woman whose ordinary song had proven, more thoroughly than any inquiry could, exactly what this crown had always secretly been built from. A year on, I am the Luna of the Iron Territories, which still strikes me as a fortune too large for a woman who once measured her worth in clean corners and fair wages. My shoulder healed to a thin pale line I will carry for good, the cost of a lie 2 generations tried to protect, and I have never once been sorry for it. We sing the old lullaby openly now. In the great hall, at every gathering where the late queen is remembered, and I am told the common folk who visit court weep, every time, to hear a song their own grandmothers taught them sung without shame from a royal throne. Bjorn sleeps through the night again, most nights, and when the old grief does wake him, I hum the same tune I hummed over that wine stain a year ago, and it settles him the way it always has, plainly, honestly, without needing to be a secret anymore. A letter came last week from Lord Wystan's own former estate, now under new stewardship, inquiring whether the new Luna might consider more favourable terms for the district's wool trade, given the old unpleasantness. I had Rolf write the reply, since my hand for letters is poor from a life spent scrubbing instead of writing. I did not gloat. Gloating and grace wear the same coat, in my experience, and it is hard to tell them apart from a distance, easier up close, where you can see which one is smiling. I confirmed favourable terms gladly, and added that the district might find its trade improved further still now, that its lords no longer needed to spend quite so much energy protecting a myth that never actually held. Bjorn found me sealing that letter at his own table, in the seat at his right hand, his wolf a warm weight across both our feet. "What are you telling them?" the king asked. "The truth," I said, that she didn't know anyone was in the room. They had all been listening for a while. I hummed a few bars of the old lullaby, low, the way I always have, and watched him close his eyes at the sound the way he still does, every time. It turns out, the whole court had been listening for a generation, one way or another, to a truth nobody wanted to be the first to sing out loud. So before I let you go, tell me what you think, because I have turned it over for a year and I still cannot settle it fully. Do you believe his wolf recognized something true in that song the very first evening, some echo of the mother he lost calling him home through an ordinary maid's careless humming? Or do you think it was simply grief, starved for 20 years of its one true comfort, reaching for the first voice that happened to sing it back? Tell me your theory below. I have decided, in the end, that I am glad the truth finally got to be sung out loud either way. And if you want to stay with us, the lullaby sung openly now in the great hall, the district finally free of its old careful lie, whatever ordinary song still waits to crack open some other guarded silence. Comment the wolf, and follow along, because I have learned that the truest things in any kingdom are very often hiding in plain sound, waiting for someone who isn't afraid to hum them. Where are you listening from tonight? Come sit with me while I work. I promise, whoever taught you your own quiet songs, they are worth singing out loud.